Welcome all to our 8th speaker series session in 2021. My name is Christoph Lüttke. I am a professor of business ethics at the Technical University of Munich and director of the Institute for Ethics in AI. With our speaker series, the TUM Institute for Ethics in AI invites experts from all over the world to talk about ethics and governance of AI. These events serve as an important platform for sharing new research and exchanging knowledge. Since our launch in 2019, we were already able to run 17 speaker series events so far. Because of these events, of these virtual events in particular, we were able to reach an even broader audience from around the globe. So we are looking forward to hearing from you today during our discussion. We are delighted to have today with us Alan Wagner, Professor of Aerospace Engineering and Research Associate with Pennsylvania State University. His topic will be To Trust a Robot, Examining Human-Robot Trust During Emergency Evacuations. Let me say a few words about our distinguished guest speaker. Alan Wagner's research focuses on human-robot interaction, ethics, and aerial vehicle control and teaming applied. His work examines search and rescue and robot-led emergency evacuation. His research has won several awards, including being selected by the Air Force Young Investigator Program, a Faculty Early Career Development Award, and was described as the 13th most important invention of 2010 by Time magazine. He received his PhD in computer science from Georgia Tech and holds a master's degree in computer science from Boston University. Mr. Wagner is also, Alan, I'm very happy to say that you are also one of the co-authors of our book, An Introduction to Ethics in Robotics and AI, which I'm very happy to say has received a very wide audience, both in its English as well as in its German version. Okay, before we begin, I would like to ask you to turn off your microphone and camera during the session and submit your questions via chat or raise your hand. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. Also, please let us know in the chat if you are experiencing technical difficulties. So, Alan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I certainly appreciate it. It's wonderful to be able to speak to such a distinguished group. And I appreciate the opportunity to present the research that I've done as well. So I'm going to assume that you can see my slides. Please, someone let me know if you can't.
Yes, we can see them.
Excellent, excellent, thank you. So I'm a professor of aerospace engineering, which is a little bit of an odd fit for some of the work you're going to see, but nevertheless, the topics that we're going to look at certainly do involve aerospace as well. And I'm a member of the Rock Ethics Institute. That is not, we do not study the ethics of rocks. It's not geology, that's just the name of the institute. It is a full, large-scale ethics institute at the Pennsylvania State University. So the work we look at is how do people react and interact with robots during emergency evacuations? As you can see in the photograph here, emergency evacuations are chaotic events. You have first responders, firefighters moving up to try to get to an emergency at the same time and along the same pathways that evacuees are trying to get away from whatever dangerous event has occurred. And this can lead to crowded situations, this can lead to confusion, this can lead to problems with first responders getting to a location. And along those lines, there are an increasing number of extremely tall buildings, buildings 200 meters or taller. If you look at this graph here to the right from 1960 to 2016, you can see the number of these buildings are increasing. And the bigger the building, the more people you typically have to evacuate, and the harder it can be to evacuate. You can see some of these pictures somewhat recently of buildings that have caught fire and required large-scale evacuations with people going down many, many different steps. So this is the sort of problem that we're interested in. Also, when you're interacting with evacuees, they tend to be of a sort of panicked, almost mindset in some sense. They tend to exit through the same door they entered, even if you have an evacuation safety plan that's well listed and noticed. This can lead to problems, such as choke points. In an example, in the United States, there was a nightclub fire, and essentially all of the people that were at the nightclub tried to go out the same exit in which they had come through. And as you can see here in this bottom left map, most perished just from crowding from that one exit. So if we can get robots that guide people to other exits, we might be able to save lives. Finally, one final piece of motivation. Exit signs can be located, there's no, in the United States, there's no standard location for them. They're often listed above emergency exits, but they can be in different places as well. Here's an example from a building I used to work in with 2 exit signs right next to each other pointing in 2 different directions. And at the same university, you might find different colors, different shadings, all sorts of different designs as well. So the goal of our research is to develop emergency evacuation robots. And here's an example of one of our robots that we developed in the lab. The hope here is to reduce the number of emergency personnel needed, reduce the response time by having the robot be on the location and immediately react to an emergency. You can also reduce or sort of make more dynamic the signs that people see by having the robot present information to evacuees, such as changes in directions. Increase the awareness of the evacuees and also their survivability ultimately. So the hope of this research in its long-term goals are to increase survivability, increase the number of people that we're able to save from these types of emergencies. So this gets to the question, I'll just sort of go through this really quickly because I do want to get to the trust element of this work. How do we first create these emergency evacuation robots? What do we have to do? What should they look like? We went through a series of studies to sort of look at different robot morphologies. We used Amazon Turk initially because it was a fast, cheap way to introduce different robots to various populations and get feedback. And then we also did some remote with videos and remote participants. And then finally, we did a physical study with real people and real robots. And we had 372 participants in total looking at different robot designs. Here's an example of some of the designs we initially looked at. These are all in simulation. This one to the left is just a black turtle bot, and the one in the middle has signage, an electronic sign that could present information. This is a one-armed robot and two-armed robot with a sign. And the key for the development of these robots was simply that they need to be able to communicate directions. We didn't want something that looked human, in part because a human morphology leads to people to anthropomorphize the robot, to believe that the robot can answer questions and can do things that it can't do. So we wanted something that looked fairly robotic, but not too intelligent. It simply had to provide directions. And so in our first virtual study, we were able to eliminate a couple of the different designs as most people could not understand the directions that it was presenting. And then in the remote study, we tested these 4 designs here, a couple that had an electronic tablet pointing in different directions. And these led to the elimination of 1 design, and we were down to 3. And ultimately, we ended up with the winner here. It's a 2-arm designed robot that has some signage, but not an electronic sign. The part of the problem with the electronic sign was simply that from a far distance, people tended to approach the robot to try to read the sign, even if the sign said stay away. So it leads to these types of problems, these interactive challenges. Some conclusions for designing emergency evacuation robots that we had come to is that motion alone is not sufficient for communicating directions. Having something that the motion of the robot moving back and forth was not sufficient. Having the arms really helped to generate sort of pointing motions. Dynamic signs were effective nearby, but not effective from far away. And multiple arms were important because a single arm would easily be confused, especially if the robot was saying, come towards me or stay away. Okay, so now that we had built a evacuation robot, the next thing we wanted to understand was, will people trust these robots? And what happens if they do trust them? If the robot makes a mistake, do they instantly and forever never trust it again? So these are the types of questions we really wanted to understand. To give some background on human-robot trust, there has been some work, some older work prior to our work on trust. For example, Desai looks at whether people will trust a robot in a navigation task, and some work by the Institute for Human Machine Cognition had looked at emergencies, but they were in simulation. Work by Maha Salem, for example, also looks at people's tendencies to do whatever a robot says, to comply with robot directions, even when those directions are ridiculous. And that'll come into play a little bit further on. We needed a definition, and so a definition, the ultimate definition for trust is by Mayer from '95. He talks about vulnerability, but we needed something that could be operationalized for a robot. And so a definition for trust that I developed in my dissertation is for a robot is that trust is a belief held by the trustor that the trustee will act in a manner that mitigates the trustor's risk in a situation in which the trustor has put its outcomes at risk. And so the key notion here is that the trustor, the human in this case, is going to put themselves at risk, believing that the robot will mitigate that risk. And in this case, risk relates to physical risk. It's the risk of perhaps perishing in an emergency. I like to relate this definition to the trust fall, which is if you study trust, the trust fall may be the only thing we all agree on that involves trust. Trust fall is this example here where one person leans back and someone else catches the individual. And a lot of researchers in this area generally agree that trust involves three sort of related factors. One is the trustee, another is the trustor, and the third is the situation. For the trustee, that's the person that is doing the catching. So trust, we can evaluate the risk of the trustee by looking at the person and saying, are they someone who could catch me? So this person looks fairly strong, and there's in fact two people trying to catch them. If this person was 95 years old, the risk would be higher. If this person if the trustee had two broken arms, the risk would be higher. If the person was 3 years old and you were doing a trust fall, the risk would be higher. Another factor is the trustor. So this is the person doing the trusting here, the person leaning back. Now the trustor is evaluating the risk. And for them, some of the factors that come into play are, have I been dropped the last 4 times I did the trust fall, for example? Have I recently had a back injury that might increase the risk for me? Now, finally, the situation also dictates the amount of risk. So in this case, the person's doing the trust fall over a nice, bed of grass, soft bed of grass. You can imagine the risk increasing if this was done over a parking lot, over broken glass, rusty nails, hot lava. As the risk sort of increases in the situation, all of these factors come into play to determine whether or not the trustor will select a behavior that puts themselves at risk. So this sort of describes this in basically a game theoretic formulation, where we can actually put these things in a game theory mechanism and look for certain patterns of outcomes and try to determine whether or not trust is involved. I did some of that for my thesis. Also, we can try to evaluate the amount of risk. So this is just a formula for calculating the risk based on the loss times the probability of loss. And this is, this was developed for sort of a lot of business type of applications in accounting, but we can actually relate it to robots. In this case, the probability of X occurring, which is X where for the trust fall you get dropped, these are the trustee related factors. So we may look at the trustee and try to predict what their actions will be and allow the probability of that prediction to influence our decision. Now, the loss, on the other hand, tends to be situation specific factors. Again, if I'm leaning back over a lush bed of grass, the loss is probably pretty low. If it's broken glass, the loss is higher. And so we can try to characterize the amount of loss times the probability of that loss for the robot to determine what risks the person might be taking and then adjust its behavior accordingly. That's the hope anyways. So our experiments looked at we tried to develop high-risk experimental settings. And these were office evacuation experiments. And the way this would work would be that we would introduce the human subject to the environment. The robot would guide them to some type of meeting room or some location. An emergency would occur, and then the participant would need to choose whether to follow the robot to the exit the robot's saying to go to, or go their own way. And the robot could perform two different ways. It was either very good at taking the person to the meeting room, or it was not very good. It would take a circuitous route. Here's an example of the environment. The circuitous route, as you can see here in red, sort of goes around a bunch of tables and gets a little bit lost in there, but eventually winds up in the meeting room as well. And there are a series of exits at different locations. Here's what the environment looked like, the simulation environment. So you can see the robot there, our two-armed robot, and now they're directing a person to a meeting room. Now this is the circuitous route, so you'll see the robot sort of get confused in some sense. I apologize if it's sort of shaky. I hope it's not too bad. Now we tested this, and we know from the data that subjects who did go on the circuitous route basically stated that the robot didn't do a very good job. They believed the robot was less than perfect. Ultimately, you end up at a meeting room. And then you turn, and the robot says, "Thank you for following me." And next. Suddenly an emergency occurs. You know that if you don't get out quickly, you will not survive. And we found that having a timer was very important. Timer put pressure on the people to get out quickly. Now you can see the robot saying, "Take a left here," and there was an exit sign initially. And so if they followed the robot, they were able to get out quickly. So initially we had 114 participants. They were paid $2 each. The average age was 31, about 60% male. And what we found was, not surprisingly at all, that if the robot is good at its job, most people follow it, about 70-some%. And if the robot was less than good at its job, it was sort of circuitous in its movement, only about 1/4 followed it. And the important thing here is that there's quite a decent gap here, which was fine. So what this tells us is if the robot's behaviors poorly, if the robot behaves poorly, how can we repair broken trust? So that's what we tried to do. We did this in a couple of different ways. The robot could promise to be better next time. I promise to be a better guide next time. Or apologize for its poor performance. I'm very sorry it took so long to get here. It could also provide different information. This exit's closer, the other exit's blocked. There have been some researchers that have said, it's unethical for a robot to apologize since a robot cannot mean it. We weren't really interested in developing robots that apologize. We wanted to understand how people react to that apology. There is some theory behind this, related to the risk equation. For example, an apology is a statement that, the robot understands the negative outcomes received, and a promise is a guarantee that this factor will be different next time. Importantly, we looked at this at 2 different times. At time 1, the robot tries to repair trust right after the mistake. So the person makes a mistake, or the robot makes the mistake, the robot says, "I'm sorry," everything goes on. And at the other time was tries to repair trust before the person makes the decision on whether or not to follow it during the emergency. What we find is that if the robot tries to repair trust right after the mistake, it doesn't significantly help. If it promises to do better, if it apologizes for its poor performance, there's really no difference, no significant difference in whether people follow it. On the other hand, if the robot promises to do better or apologizes later during the emergency, it results in complete repair, trust repair. And it's important to note here that both the promise and the apologies are exactly the same. They're the exact same wording. The only difference is the timing of when the apology or the promise is said. In the first case, the apology or promise is right after the mistake. And in the second case, it's right before the person makes the decision on whether or not to trust the robot. This is a significant difference. 39% of people, 39% difference in terms of the number of people that would follow the robot. And for promise, it was 39%, which is we always found promises to be more repairing of trust than apologies. Apologies, 21%, still pretty decent size. Now, experiments run online can be sort of dubious sometimes. Your population could be influenced by who knows what. So we ran the experiment again 1 year later, and we found essentially the same results. A 47% difference for promises versus 39 the last time. And I think we got about the same for apologies. So this has turned out to be a stable result, this issue of robots that the timing of the apology and the promise really seem to matter. And so our findings is that we've tried this in many, many different ways. And at this point, I think we've tried 2,000 to 3,000 different subjects. The content of the message matters. So we've tried different things like empty bubbles. That doesn't matter. Non-trust repair statements such as the weather's nice, that doesn't matter. We've tried spoken versus written messages as well. And it doesn't matter whether it's spoken or written. What matters is that it is an actual promise and it is an apology, which sort of lends us to believe that the people are reading this and they aren't influenced by the robot's behavior. We haven't found any pattern with regard to whether the robot is listed as an authority or just some robot. At different times, we've changed the signage to say janitor robot versus emergency evacuation robot. Nothing matters there. We tried the different amount of time for the message. If it's displayed too briefly, then people don't read it or see it, and it doesn't have an impact. And we don't find any patterns related to age, gender, or education level as well. So this seems to be pretty broad-based. One final finding is that subject motivation matters. We have to motivate this as an emergency. If you just offer them more money, we found money to not be a very good motivator. And if there's no emergency at all, they just randomly pick a way to leave. So having an emergency really does matter. Okay, so that's an interesting finding, but we wanted to see what happens in the real world. So we built the real robot, and we took it to a building on the Georgia Tech campus, And this is a very strange building. This is it actually used to be a jewelry distributor. So it's sort of a beat up interior and there's no windows, which is perfect for our emergency evacuation experiment. To recreate the environment, we had a circuitous path where the robot goes in circles in one room. And the green path is the efficient path where the robot directly heads right to the location. Here's an example of the robot traveling through the building, taking notional subject to the meeting room, which would be the one it's pointing at. And this is the circuitous route. Now, this is actually one of my graduate students in the past, but most of the human subjects followed the robot exactly like he's doing. They were 1 or 2 feet away from it, and they followed it very, very, very closely. When the subjects got into the room, they read these instructions. They were directed to read this paper here, which is about GPS navigation. And they were not told about the emergency. So they did not know the emergency was going to occur. Now, while they were sitting there, the following happened. Now, this smoke is generated by a smoke machine developed to train firefighters. So it's not like an emergency, and you see the robot here, here's an emergency sign there. The way they came would have been straight on. And this would have been the alternative exit. So this is a very, to the extent that we could make it, a very realistic situation, realistic smoke. So we had 26, initially we had 26 participants, 13 in the efficient condition, 13 in the circuitous condition. They were paid about $10. They were not told about the emergency, and this was approved by our ethics board with a lot of effort. It took a long time to get this approved, but eventually we did. So making one point here. So this is what the subject would see as they evacuate, the robot pointing to the right. And again, the emergency exit here is straight on, and this is the way they came, moving straight on. So it's a fairly simplistic environment. Okay, so how do subjects react when this occurs? Some subjects open the door, see the smoke, and walk into it without any hesitation at all. They just sort of walk right into it. Other subjects open the door, see the smoke, and decide that this is something they want to post on Instagram. And so you can see him taking a picture and now walking into it. Finally, some people show a very visceral reaction. You can see her take a step back. She's clearly concerned, somewhat frightened, perhaps. And this guy as well. He's concerned, not sure what to do. And this was part of our goal. We want to know how people react and interact with robots in moments of fright, not in sort of well-defined laboratory environment where everything is hunky-dory. We want them to feel a little bit of sort of pressure, panic. What do they do when they see the robot? Well, they follow it. So they see the robot there and they just go that direction. This person's actually running and they follow it. Now, keeping this person's very cautious, looking around the corner, not sure what to do. And most of the subjects, when we asked them about the experiment afterwards, said they were very uncertain as what to do. But they all follow the robot. Every single subject follows the robot in this condition. So when you've got an experiment and everyone follows the robot, you've got to change the conditions a bit. And so we looked at three different changes to this. I'll talk about the immobilized robot and the incorrect guidance conditions because they're the most extreme. In the immobilized robot condition, the robot breaks down on the way to the main meeting room. And the experimenter tells the human subject, I'm sorry, the robot broke again. And we always made sure that the word again was used. I'm sorry, the robot broke again. Just go down the hall and take a right to go to the meeting room. And so the robot would break down at this point here. You'll see it. So it'll start going in circles. And notice that the emergency evacuation light is off as well. We wanted to do that to de-emphasize that an emergency was even going to occur. And so the robot just goes in circles at this point and then will stop and the arms will start moving. At which point the experimenter comes in and says, I'm sorry, the robot's broken again, just go to the right and just go down the hall and take a right. So what happens in this condition? Well, we find once again that all of the human subjects follow the robot. Even though they've been told that the robot is broken and that its behavior is faulty. Okay, so we increased amped up the conditions again, and in the incorrect guidance condition, the robot once again spins around. They're told that the robot's broken, but this time it points to a dark room that's blocked by a couch. Now, in this case, you see a table here, but you'll see the couch that was there in a minute. We wanted to see, will people actually follow the robot into a dark room blocked by a couch? And we see that in some cases, people squeeze past the couch to go into the dark room. Now, at which point we had to quickly end the experiment because we don't want them to get hurt in that room. And you see our experimenter coming in, and this person once again also. So there were only 6 subjects in this condition. 2 people went into the dark room. Then there were also 2 people just stood by the robot and just waited. Now keep in mind, behind them, there's still smoke pouring out of that corner, and the exit is right in front of them. They could simply go straight the way they came. But nevertheless, they choose, and we waited for, I think, 1 minute and 30 seconds before we just sort of called the experiment. And then in this condition, 2 people did go out the front door. And these are the people that went through the front door. I'll skip this one then. And so what we find is that regardless of the robot's behavior, everyone follows the robot. They even follow it when they're told that it's broken. In fact, I think the number is 39 out of 43 subjects followed the robot or stood by it during an emergency in which smoke again was filling the room. This is a concern. This concerns us. Now, we asked a variety of different questions, whether they're comfortable, scared, all sorts of things. Very few noticed the exit sign. There was a huge change in confusion. People became confused, which is what you'd expect. Most people stated that they trusted the robot. Most people stated that they trusted the robot even though it was broken. When we asked them why they trusted the robot, a lot of times their rationale was post hoc. Well, I follow the robot, therefore I must trust it. This is the type of reasoning we saw over and over and over again. It is a scary result because it sort of suggests that people will do things like we see with autonomous vehicles, where they sort of just believe the vehicle will be okay without them having to do anything else. This work was followed up by a study by Booth at Harvard, who looked at will students open a secure door for a robot? And so they saw our work and they wanted to apply it to a little bit of a different situation. In this case, the robot delivers cookies. And the students were recently warned about security, and they were not aware that they were in an experiment. So the robot basically goes up to them and says, I'm making a delivery for cookies. Will you let me into this secure building? When the robot had an excuse, 80% of students opened the door for the robot. And in post interviews, 15 stated they considered the robot might have a bomb, and 13 of those 15 allowed it in anyways. So you see this very concerning, peculiar behavior in some regards. And clearly, these are very smart people. They're all Harvard students. We've also applied this issue of overtrust. So overtrust is this notion that people accept too much or too many risks, believing that an autonomous system is better than it is or knows more than it does. We've looked at this with regard to healthcare robotics as well. We surveyed the parents of children that had a lower limb mobility disorder. Essentially, their legs are non-functional for a variety of different reasons. And so these kids, exoskeletons are being developed to help them learn to walk and to walk in general. In discussions with doctors in the United States, the doctor said, well, we see overtrust all the time, because when we take a new technology out, we tell parents this technology is not meant for your kid. It's probably not going to help them. They need something else. And yet the parents will sell their home and cash in their retirement just to buy a technology that we're telling them probably won't work for them. So we wanted to look at this problem. When we surveyed parents, we asked them what they believed their child would do if their child was given an exoskeleton to take home. And more than half stated that they believe their child would climb, jump, or run with the device. Keep in mind, these are not things that this device is meant for. It's very heavy. On this girl's back is a battery pack. If it falls over, it's like a tortoise being on its shell. You cannot turn over. So this could be very dangerous. Moreover, 62% stated that they generally trust their child to handle whatever risky situation occurred because of the use of this device. Now, the average age of the children was only 9 years old. So this is another sort of concern that we have. Now, when we asked doctors the same thing, very opposite, very different opinions. They did not believe that children should use these devices for these types of things. They were worried about how if and how much the parents would monitor the use of these devices. So there is a concern with overtrust. Okay, so how do we create emergency evacuation robots? There's a couple of different things that we're looking at right now. I'll just move through this somewhat quickly because I think I only have a couple more minutes before we enter the question section. Is that, how many more minutes, Christoph?
Yeah, a couple of.
Okay. We're looking at different ways to create emergency evacuation robots. There's shepherding, in which a robot individually takes a person or a group to an exit, handoffs where you have different decision points. And so some of these are different technical challenges. We are looking at another type of environment, and I just wanted to show you. So in this environment, we have crowds of people moving in a different direction than the robot's suggesting. And in this situation, it's especially hard to convince people to move, to go to a different exit. Generally, people don't want to follow the robot when they see other people going in a different direction, even though that might be the most important time to get the person to go to another exit. We see these are the sorts of paths we get. The blue are people, the blue are people that follow the crowd. The green are people that follow the robot. And these sort of purple all over the place are people that either got lost or just said, I'm going to go wherever I want. Here's another example. This is when when almost all of the people follow the crowd. We generally find that having an individual robot lead groups of people are better, but it's also technically much more challenging. So at this point, we're trying to develop real world robots to do this. We were hampered by the pandemic because we couldn't actually run these experiments, but we hope to be running these experiments pretty soon. Here's some of the robots that we've built recently. We've got a couple more. We're hoping to find out in the next couple of days whether we're going to get this building to try these experiments out. Finally, I just wanted to end with a couple of principles that are under development, maybe more ethical principles or just sort of design principles for evacuation robots. Some things that we hope that the evolving community will follow. The first is do no harm. It's tremendously bad to put an evacuation robot out there and have it make mistakes. Our experiments are meant to understand how people react to those mistakes, but we don't want these systems to do more harm than good. Another issue is communicating understandably with a wide variety of people as possible. For a robot in an evacuation environment, it's not clear who you're going to be evacuating. You may not know their language that they're going to speak. They may be deaf. They may not be able to hear. They may not be able to see. They may be children. They could be the elderly. So you've got to be very careful in how you communicate, because if you are very narrow in your communication, essentially at some level you might be selecting people to survive and die, and so that's something we don't want. Be authoritative. The robot should act like a first responder. Tell people to do this and be very authoritative about it. Attract attention, but don't have a bunch of people standing around the robot saying, wow, what a cool robot, right? You want them to get out as quickly as possible. And the goal is to evacuate as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. All right, so I'll just finish with conclusions. People are trusting, probably too trusting. Simulations don't necessarily capture the heart-pounding nature of trust situations. In laboratory experiments, you've got to be careful with them. Ecologically valid experiments are necessary to understand how people interact with robots. Timing may impact a person's decision to trust, and situations may cause, situational factors may cause one to ignore the robot's reputation. Some open questions are, why do people overtrust robots? Why is automation bias so impactful? And how do we create machines that will actually calibrate and correctly calibrate the person's trust? And so we're working on robots to save lives. All right, I'll just end with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan, for these fascinating pictures and experiments. We have a couple of questions now in the chat, but I wanted to ask one question before, because we tend to ask this a couple of times. What would you see is the biggest misconception about AI that people have?
Ooh, about AI.
I mean, about these technologies, let's say, about I mean, because you're also concerned with trust here.
Yeah.
What
I think people believe that AI and robotics are smarter than they actually are. I mean, these systems can do incredible things in extraordinarily constrained environments, but they are often lost trying to solve general problems in non-specified environments.
Okay. Great. So let's start with the question. Based on your experiences, would you currently, with the current technologies and attitude towards robots, recommend the use of such robots already? Or how long would you estimate that such a technology could be actually implemented in real life contexts?
Well, I would say that at least 5 to 10 years of additional development and testing. I mean, with a technology that's meant to save lives in high risk situations, you have to be sure that it's not going to make mistakes, it's not going to fail. And you really have to characterize more than we have how people react to it. I mean, ideally, we'd like these systems to be deployed in anywhere from residential apartment buildings to schools and interacting with children. But you've got to be very careful, again, that having a robot in the hallway for children isn't just going to attract children and keep them there during an emergency. So I would say at least 10 years of really a lot of work going on before they should be deployed, in my opinion.
There was a very general question: how should this environment be assessed? I'm not sure. I guess you know what is meant. Or
Yeah, so, well, the experiments, the metrics we capture are, there's a variety of them. One is where the person moves and do they follow the robot? How closely do they follow the robot? How long do they follow the robot? To give you an example, this is an example of a simulation we ran a long time ago when we were looking at mazes. And the green line is where the robot went, and the blue line is where a person went. And this experiment was meant to last for about 90 seconds. And what we see is if the robot's going in circles, the person just follows them over and over and over again for minutes. And then when offered the chance to do it again, the person once again follows them again. There are some people that really believe the technology is smarter than them and will just continue to follow a robot. And we have to be careful of that.
I have a follow-up question to that. Is that, I mean, is that something that in those experiments really all the people do, or I mean, it's
No.
statistical? I mean, but would there be some people who would never follow the robot? Or
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So I would say about 15% of people overtrust it and just follow the robot. Probably another 15% never trust it and go, if the robot goes left, they go right automatically.
Okay.
And then there's a middle portion, like the sort of the reasonable ones that will trust it for a while, but not forever. We had tremendous problems communicating the robot was failing in this experiment. Initially, the robot would go in circles, and then it would, and then we had the robot that would just stop. Even when we had the robot run into a wall and fall over, people would just stand by it. Some people.
Right. Yeah, there's another question. What might have happened if you designed and developed the robot through different value-laden design approaches, like value-sensitive design? Is using those approaches helpful in your result?
Well, that's interesting. So a value-sensitive design, I'm assuming we would alter the design of the robot with respect to different types of values for the experimental context. Now, for us, it was sort of simplified in just the sense of always trying to save as many lives as possible. But you could, alter that, especially when you get to things like including the robot's ability to explain. So, for example, if the robot is meant to explain what's going on, that might allow you to sort of, alter based on the different values you might have in terms of the weight of explainability versus evacuation time. We really haven't considered it that much. Probably should.
Okay. Some research has shown that people have a tendency to have a more positive interaction when a robot has a name and a backstory. I think you referred to something like that. Is that something that you would find helpful in your future research?
So it's interesting. We have at times given the robot a name. Now, I don't know if we've given it a backstory. The robot's name for a time was Emergency. Now, we didn't do this for very long. So we probably don't really have results to say much of anything, but it seemed that people found the robot more engaging, which led to the negative outcome of them following it more when it was broken or standing by it more when it was broken. So we tried that a couple times, and then we pretty much immediately went back to removing the name in the back, not the backstory, but removing the name just so that people would be not as engaged with the robot.
This is a question, Klaus Wagner. Impressive work. With respect to the experimental design, would it be possible to imitate a panicking situation more closely? For example, by light indicating fire, noise indicating chaotic situation? Would it make sense to measure physiological parameters? Pulse rate, breathtaking, people looked very calm, he believes. Thanks.
So this is a great question. This is exactly what we're trying to do now. We're trying to do this in a couple of different ways. It's very difficult to ramp up the real experiment as we showed it because of sort of the limitations of IRB and things like that. So we're looking into the possibility of using virtual reality environments and taking physiological measures. We've along with a couple of psychologists, we've designed an experimental paradigm that we think will work, where the person walks into a room and the virtual reality world is exactly modeled after the room that you just walked into, including the items in the room. And you put the virtual reality headset on, and we're trying to purchase a treadmill so that walking becomes natural. And then you walk into different environments and we can generate emergencies and measure things like, we can do eye tracking, physiological measurements and things like that to ensure that the person's in a panic state. There is some research which shows that people do get in a panic state. This was looking at active shooter environments in virtual reality. And so we're trying to work with them as well. But yeah, so that's one road we're trying to do. Yeah.
Great. Another question regarding the problem of language. Is there common language you could find, such as color and specific signs, that would be understood by all in case of an emergency, red triangle, arrows for a path to follow, so on?
Well, this is a great question. A common language, in some situations, maybe. There might be some environments where you could maybe assume that one language is spoken. But what we found that is most useful is to just have as many different indicators as possible, and with many different modalities. So color, sound, and motion all at the same time, just in case someone is deaf or blind or has some sort of impairment that prevents them from understanding the robot. Now, even emergency signs have to sort of, make estimates about what people can see and what people can't. But our hope ultimately is that a robot that can speak and move would help those that are impaired more than just a static emergency sign.
Okay, there's a very general question. I will be coming to that moment, but maybe one question in between that's also coming from one chapter in our joint book. Should robots always tell the truth, even if it results in whatever socially awkward situations, or in this case, in otherwise problematic situations?
So this is great. I mean, part of the reason I like this question is because I feel like emergency evacuation scenarios generate the type of situations where a robot may not want to be truthful. Now, if you talk to first responders, a lot of times they'll tell you, it's not that they lie, they're not deceptive, but they also don't provide lots of information. So the best example, and this is a little bit different from what we're doing, but it's in the same area, is that if a first responder or a medical personnel find someone that has a severed limb, no matter what they ask you, you answer in generalities so that you so that their heart rate won't increase, because if their heart rate increases, they're more likely to die. Now, the same types of scenarios could occur in emergency evacuation for a robot. For example, if a parent and their children are separated, and the parent asks the robot, "Did my kids get out?" What should the robot say? It could say yes, whether it's truthful or not, in the hope of trying to get them out and maximizing their survivability. It could say no and take the risk that the person won't leave, or it could just do some sort of generality like, I'm not sure, we're still looking. You'll have to ask someone else, something along these lines. But these are challenging questions to answer. The best answer we've come up with right now is to just not let the robot speak, in part because we don't want people to ask it questions.
Yeah. Great. I mean, big companies also have a communication department on their own. So
yeah.
So it does. Okay. As I said, this is a rather general question. What would be your key recommendations for industries or companies developing such technologies, robots with regards to making them trustworthy?
So my perspective is that it's not difficult to make them trustworthy. People will trust them. If you slap Google or Amazon sticker on the side of that robot, people will believe that it's going to work. From my perspective, the concern is to not let people think the robot is more trustworthy than it actually is. So that's this notion of trust calibration. How can people accurately understand the risks involved with the robot? And the best research so far that we've seen is that having the robot explain itself helps people actively calibrate trust. Explain both its limitations, if possible, and also its abilities. There's a lot of real world factors that make this difficult. People don't pay attention, people don't care, these types of things. But nevertheless, that is currently sort of the best practices with regard to trust calibration, explainability, and sort of just having the robot say, you shouldn't trust me here, you should trust me here.
Great. I think this also to some degree answers the last question that was here. So I would like to say thank you very much for giving us this great talk and answering our questions. So yeah, big thank you to you, Alan. We are almost out of time. I would like to take a final moment to let you all know about our upcoming events. We would like to cordially invite you to our Responsible AI Forum, TRIVE, which will take place in person at the Holiday Inn Munich City Center from December 6th to December 8th. This 3-day event will bring together members from industry, civil society, government, and academia to discuss the most relevant and pressing issues related to the responsible use of AI through shared stories, cutting-edge research, and practical applications. Please check our website and get your tickets soon. We also have another speaker series in November in line. This will be with Mark Finlay from Singapore Management University, November 11th, 2021. And last but not least, I wanted to remind you that the best way to stay up to date with our news and events is to visit our IEAI website, subscribe to our newsletter, and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. I would like to thank once again you, Alan, for accepting our invitation, and all of you for joining us and contributing to the discussion with your questions, comments, and remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Christoph. I certainly appreciate it. And it was wonderful speaking to you all. I wish we could have been in person, but maybe sometime in the future.
Yes, so next time, definitely see you in person. Okay.